During the Rhodesian Bush War, the Rhodesians who were defending their country fought valiantly. Engagement after engagement was won decisively by the security forces. In fact, the Rhodesians were so successful militarily that they were often referred to as the greatest little fighting force on the planet. The kill-to-death ratio of the Rhodesian light infantry, according to some estimates, could have been as high as 50-1. The Rhodesian Bush War, however, was a war of two halves. In the background of the fighting, the traditional war, there was another war going on in parallel, a war of birth rates, immigration, and emigration. In the former battleground, the Rhodesians won a crushing victory. In the latter, they were mercilessly crushed. A couple of things before we begin. First of all, a quick disclaimer. This video may be on a somewhat controversial topic, but that does not mean it needs to be a controversial video. It can be discussed maturely. This is purely a work of history, and is in no way, shape, or form political. Please be normal, and don't make this video something which it is not. Thank you. Secondly, a gigantic thank you to those of you who have signed up to my Subscribe Star or as YouTube members. Without your kind donations, this channel simply would not exist, and it is the only thing which allows me to do these videos for a living. Even the lowest $5 tier goes a long, long way, and I cannot thank you all enough. It means the world. Cheers. Ian Smith was once to remark that Rhodesia had been unlucky due to her having been founded right at the tail end of the British Empire. He was quite right. If Rhodesia had been founded a century earlier, we would today see a white state encompassing Zambia and everything south of it. Rhodes, Smuts, and many other great men like them all had a vision of a sort of United States of South Africa, encompassing much of Central and all of Southern Africa. At the time, this didn't seem unrealistic at all. Time, however, was not on Rhodesia's side. Instead of becoming an African version of the United States, another Canada, another New Zealand, or another Australia, she was instead to be branded as racist by the mother country and destroyed. When the white man turned up in 1890, the settlers found nothing but horrifying barbarism. The Matabele, a Zulu-descended tribe, occupied the western half of what became Rhodesia, and they lorded it over the Mashona, who occupied the eastern half. Raids, which saw entire Mashona villages wiped from the face of the earth for little to no reason, were simply an everyday reality. The Matabele were brutal enough to themselves as well. On top of this, the Africans had made no advancement in any field of any kind. This was a land without the wheel, or even multi-story buildings. It goes without saying that there was no medical developments of any kind. The Africans bred like rabbits, but their way of life and their lack of medical advancement meant that their numbers remained controlled. This was not a land where many men got the chance to live long lives. When the white man arrived, he brought his civilization with him. The natives went to war in 1893 and then rebelled in 1896, but they were essentially just fighting against their own interests. Never had Africans had such a high standard of living, and never had they lived under such safety. This newfound safety was actually, in the long run, their greatest strength. The blacks began to breed like rabbits, and the offspring would actually survive this time. The whites never stood a chance population-wise. The white population percentage hit its peak in 1961 when the figure reached 5.7%. Between 1955 and 1964, it remained above 5% the entire time. From then onwards, the numbers began to plummet and never stopped. In absolute terms, the white population of Rhodesia peaked at only 277,000. For reference, there is well over 10 times that number of blacks in the United Kingdom today. The Rhodesian government was always aware of this issue, but they were never able to get a handle on it. Their goals regarding demographics declined over time. Initially, they were aiming for a white majority like Australia or New Zealand, but when this proved impossible, they aimed for a composition more like South Africa, which was merely 25% white. When this, too, proved impossible, they aimed to stabilize the current ratios. This, too, was unworkable. Each and every battle against the war of numbers was lost. Even before independence, it was always this numbers problem that was a thorn in Rhodesia's side. As Josiah Brownell put it, quote, "The difficulty that long existed in classifying and rationalizing Rhodesia within the imperial system was largely because it was always a settler colony with too few settlers." End quote. Rhodesia was a dominion in all but name, and was the only colony which had a high commission in London. The little self-governing colony was essentially what the old dominions were immediately prior to the enactment of the Statute of Westminster in 1931. The Rhodesians were essentially lingering in imperial purgatory at exactly the worst time. An important starting question for some is perhaps why the demographics mattered at all. Certain liberals at the time did not understand or chose not to understand what the consequences of demographic change would be. To these types, peoples are simply interchangeable and life would go on in a fair manner, with everyone judging and treating each other based on the content of their characters. This is not how reality works. The Rhodesians had Kenya to look to if they wanted to see what being a super minority meant. In Africa, Rhodesia represented the middle ground when it came to white settlement. In South Africa, whites made up almost a quarter of the population, whereas in Kenya, the whites were outnumbered 130 to 1. Rhodesia was 18 to 1 at around the same time as Kenya gained independence in 1963. The feeling of being swamped by the African masses had always been at the back of colonial minds, but had long been dormant. Africans were living better than they ever had in history, and whites, naturally, figured that they would be appreciative of this and just allow the current course to play out, since it was benefiting them too. Logically speaking, they were right, but Africa was not a logical place. By the time the 1960s came around, the whites began to see things very differently. The blacks had been whipped up by African nationalism, and the rest of the world was helping with their push towards decolonization, which they considered to be a great moral cause. This was all very easy to say from abroad, but for the whites on the ground, it all came off very differently. The white settlers, who had brought civilization to Africa and made the Africans' lives a relative paradise, were now being viewed as somehow evil, and the whole world, essentially, was supporting the African nationalist efforts to slaughter them, no matter if they were man, woman, or child. Horrifying atrocities, obviously, followed. In Kenya, it didn't take much convincing for the whites to up sticks and leave. There simply was no hope. The numerical odds were insurmountable. The whites headed south to the relatively more secure settler communities of Rhodesia and South Africa and took their civilization with them. In Rhodesia, the state attempted to discover what their own situation was actually like in the early 1960s, and a census was conducted for the first time. The findings shocked Rhodesian society and the government alike, and the latter immediately set about trying to address these imbalances, as they put it. Whites had always known they were outnumbered in their own country, but not to this scale. The Rhodesian perception of Rhodesia essentially changed overnight, now the actual figures were available. The first phase of the census in September 1961, which covered the white, Asian, and coloured populations, took merely a week, and everything was orderly. The figures were largely as expected. 220,610 whites were counted in southern Rhodesia. The second phase was the first of its kind and covered the entire black population. It was unimaginatively named Operation Big Count, and 3,000 enumerators were sent out on bicycles or on foot to determine the age, sex, territory of birth, education, physical disabilities, and employment of the African population. The number 3,000 was chosen to allow for one enumerator per 1,000 Africans, as the pre-census estimate of the African population was 3 million. Despite ZAPU interference in this completely apolitical, technical, and administrative task in which the enumerators were physically attacked on several occasions, there was some kind of result. The entire ordeal had taken far longer than expected, but it was discovered that there were roughly 3,600,000 Africans in Rhodesia, a horrifying 20% higher than expected. The whites were outnumbered by nearly 18 to 1. The 3% growth rate per annum was also revised to 3.5%. The 1969 census would reveal that the ratios were then 22 to 1, and that there were 4,818,000 Africans in the country. Between 1962 and 1969, there was a net increase of 980,000 Africans. The European population only increased by 7,000. The Rhodesia Herald, which was by no means right-wing, immediately wrote in their editorial concerning the first census regarding the problems this African population growth created, with greater strains on the economy and increasing land pressures being at the top of the list. All of these people simply couldn't be provided for, and naturally, the disaffected masses would fall right into the arms of African terrorists like ZAPU, who would promise them the world. Soon after the spring census, there were letters appearing in the Herald from concerned Rhodesians demanding mass white immigration and state-sponsored family planning in African communities. The Herald itself ran an editorial in October 1963 titled "Prepare to Meet Our Doom," and in September 1964, another editorial wrote in relief that Rhodesia's population problems were finally receiving the public attention they deserved. A paranoia, albeit a justified one, was sweeping the nation. The events next door in the Congo were certainly adding fuel to the fire. As the Congo collapsed, the whites were subjected to horrifying atrocities, and the refugees flooded into Rhodesia with all their stories of rape and murder to tell. The Rhodesians looked at the future with dismay, and the population projections were the most frightening figures of all. It was estimated in 1964 that the African population would go from 3.5 million, as cited then, to 7 million in 1982, a doubling in merely 18 years. It was unlike anything else in history. If this were the white population, then there would have been utter rejoicing, but this was another thing altogether. The black population of Rhodesia largely refused to accept any of the unlimited opportunities they were given when it came to education, healthcare, or any of the other great benefits of Western civilization. They simply bred and demanded more and more handouts, offering nothing at all to the economy. It was all take, no give. In blunt economic terms, this extra 3.5 million Africans would just be one great big net drain that the white man could simply not afford. One report gave a figure of 12 million for the year 2000. Another claimed 16 million, which was repeated by a former MP and cabinet minister. After the later 1969 census, the government's chief town planning officer gave a prediction of 20 million. In 1971, the Herald predicted 25 million. This problem simply had to be dealt with if Rhodesia was to have any kind of future at all as a functional state. It all felt very much like when Count Mirabeau had warned the white colonists of Haiti that they slept on the edge of Vesuvius. The government tried to tackle the issue right away, albeit softly. In 1962, a bill was presented that sought to mandate registration for all African births and deaths, which was already what was required of every other racial group in the country. At the same time, a bill was introduced which eliminated migratory labor from other African nations. In 1964, another bill was proposed which would issue mandatory identity cards to control the African influx into the cities, and also sought greater border restrictions. All of these initiatives were met with gigantic opposition due to their logistical difficulties, and were abandoned or watered down before becoming law. For example, the Births and Deaths Registration Bill was rejected as unfeasible, and the resultant act only mandated Africans in certain urban areas to register this information. Everywhere else, it was to be voluntary. Despite their inclusion in the bill, the urban Africans mostly just ignored the registration requirements anyway, with no repercussions at all. Measures regarding the border met tough resistance from the rural Rhodesian businesses. Without this cheap foreign labor, they said, they simply wouldn't be able to function. The actual local Rhodesian blacks themselves simply didn't want to work. They just wanted to sit around in their huts all day and collect welfare. These measures were watered down to stop new imports, but left those already in Rhodesia alone. The measures to prevent the cities being swamped by Africans was predictably weak too. In a schoolmasterly tone, Smith asked in his 1968 end-of-year message for employed Africans in the city to, quote, "work hard and not risk losing your urban jobs through laziness or indifference. To those who have no employment, I would say leave the towns and go into the country where there is ample work available," end quote. This did nothing, and neither did massive investment into developing the tribal trust lands, which were reserved exclusively for Africans. The pull of the white cities was too strong. The ability to do nothing and leech off the productive proportion of the population was much easier there. The blacks were already the majority in the cities anyway, but now things were just getting ridiculous. In Salisbury, for example, the African population increased by a whopping 5% in 1 year. In total, they numbered 236,000, that being 10,000 more than the entire white population of Rhodesia at the time. These measures were termed separate development or provincialism, but were essentially just very soft apartheid. The whites were only limited to certain areas of the country, whereas the blacks could go anywhere and had their own areas. Almost all Rhodesians supported the Africans remaining with their own. And as Josiah Brownell put it in his book on the topic, quote, "The idea's popularity reflected the appeal for whites of disclaiming responsibility for growing African numbers, and the desire among white politicians that Africans should be forced to shoulder the costs of their own rapid growth, instead of burdening the largely urban white population," end quote. The issue didn't go away. In May 1973, a bill mandating African identity cards was introduced to distinguish local from migrant Africans. This was, of course, nothing but a half measure, and it completely failed to please the clear-thinking hardliners. A plan in 1976 was introduced, which would create identity cards for every African in Rhodesia over a period of 5 years, but the regime collapsed before this could take place. All the other measures never went anywhere either, and logistical problems and costs were always the excuse. This, of course, was all avoiding the elephant in the room. It was all well and good documenting the Africans, but measures had to actually be put in place to tackle the problem at the root. So how did the Rhodesians actually attempt, or suggest attempting, to solve the problem? One of the biggest problems with an increasing population is, of course, employment. Most blacks simply didn't want to work and chose not to, but those who actually did want to work found that there simply wasn't many jobs. African school leavers were entering the labour market at an unprecedented rate due to sheer numbers. In 1968, the Minister of Social Welfare and Labour argued that to fully address the problem of Africans falling into urban unemployment, quote, "The important thing should be to divert the aspirations of school children from white-collar jobs, though teachers found it difficult to put this across when dealing with future employment prospects," end quote. More numbers also obviously meant more schools and teachers, and greater expenses for the productive section of society. In 1967, one Rhodesian front backbencher suggested that if education was to continue to be provided for all at current costs, then African parents should have to agree to use birth control as a quid pro quo. 2 years beforehand, the Smith government decided to peg education spending at 2% of the GNP, regardless of African population numbers. There was, after all, only so much that the little Rhodesian state could afford. The policy had no direct anti-natalist aims, but the result, obviously, was a lot of angry Africans complaining about a gap in their education, a deterioration of education standards, and a rise in illiteracy. The problem, though, was obviously with them and their breeding practices, not the government. In terms of jobs, the Rhodesian government remained absolutely staunch on their policy of meritocracy. The Africans were already given a lot, but direct affirmative action to solve African unemployment would obviously result in a lot more competent white workers missing out. This, in turn, would put white immigrants off Rhodesia, as it would become a worse place to live. Forcing Africans into jobs would then only worsen the problem and swamp the state even faster due to fewer whites actually coming in. It was this one idea alone, white immigration, that the Rhodesians saw as their salvation. White birth rates were going down at this point, but that seems to have been taken for granted, and it was recognized from the get-go that it would be white immigration and African family planning that would solve the problem, not white pronatalism or African immigration. White birth rates were collapsing all across the world, but the Rhodesian rate was collapsing especially fast. The African birth rate was also exploding all across the world, but again, uniquely to Rhodesia, the African rate was exploding especially fast. Two global phenomena were playing out in exactly the same place at the exact same time in an exaggerated fashion. Before the war, Rhodesians had a higher birth rate than all the other settler colonies, including the US, and a far higher birth rate than the mother country. By war's end, Rhodesia was the lowest of the lot. The sacrifices and stresses of war destroyed Rhodesian fertility. Immediately after the 1962 census, Rhodesia was still a federation, and her economic planners began to demand a huge increase in white immigration in an effort to actually employ these surplus Africans who had been discovered by the census. The Ministry of Home Affairs published a report which stated that Rhodesia should aim for 12,000 white immigrants for the year 1962-63. It was suggested that this number should increase by 1,000 every year thereafter, so that by 1969-70, there would be 20,000 whites coming in per year. Only this huge level of immigration, they argued, could ensure the ideal racial economic ratios to keep Rhodesia functional. Brownell writes, quote, "A specific target ratio for Africans per European was proposed by Professor Jan Sadie from Stellenbosch University when he conducted a wide-ranging government-sponsored survey of Rhodesia's economy in 1967. In his report, he stated that on average, every European employed 7.4 Africans. Stemming from this ratio, Sadie concluded, and subsequent governments concurred, that white population growth must provide at least so many whites as to create unemployment for Africans as they entered the job market. Sadie concluded that this pegging of white immigration to African natural increase meant that Rhodesia should aim for at least 12,000 immigrants a year. It is also significant that the Sadie report attached equal importance to African family planning as another means to redress the racial imbalance. Sadie's findings and the demographic solutions sections of his report were affirmed by the government and set out a blueprint for the state's population policies to follow, end quote. The real figures, however, were nowhere near enough. As noted, the white population only increased by 7,000 between the 1962 and the 1969 census. 4 months after the second census shocked the nation, the Rhodesian Front Congress passed a resolution which stated that white immigration should be as unselective as possible. This second census had actually been scheduled for 1966, but due to the inevitable panic it would cause, this kept being delayed. After UDI in 1965, the government was very eager not to reveal the true extent of the population problem, so as to not scare off potential white immigrants. For whatever reason, the government relented in 1969, and then never again did they repeat a census of that kind for obvious reasons. In 1978, the Smith government considered banning the publication of white emigration figures for exactly the same reasons. When the emigration trickle became a flood, it was decided that this measure would actually exacerbate white population anxiety, however, not soothe it. The measures directly taken against the ever-increasing horde were never anywhere near good enough. Several public figures and politicians named African population growth as the biggest problem facing Rhodesia, even compared to the ever-escalating military war. The pressures on the treasury due to social spending, education and housing, on the nation's infrastructure and on her food supply were simply overwhelming. In a way, the government was a little stuck. One way to lower African birth rates was to pull them closer to white society. This was empirically proven to lower African birth rates, yet this would also lower the white quality of life, and thus reduce white immigration. The opposite solution was to push Africans further away in an apartheid/separate development type system. This was proven to cause birth rates to go up, but at least then Africans would have their own areas far away from whites. This essentially amounted to ignoring the problem and hoping for the best. It also ignored the reality that blacks wanted to flood into civilized white spaces. The government tried both strategies at the same time. The approach was completely incoherent. Only in the late 60s did the government begin to get more engaged with this topic, and even then, most of it was just lamenting that the problem existed, rather than doing what needed to be done. John Raffel, Minister of Finance, said in his 1971 budget speech, quote, "The African people should have no illusions about the future. If they wish to attain a reasonable standard of life for their children, free from the frustration of thwarted aspirations, and free from the misery of poverty, the realities of the situation demand a concerted effort to limit population growth," end quote. And the Minister of Public Service, quote, "We cannot have the European continuing to be wholly responsible for the development of Rhodesia, as has been the position for many generations. Africans, in increasing numbers, need to come forward to help in shouldering the immense burden of developing and improving Rhodesia," end quote. A cabinet memorandum from 1970 concluded that Africans needed to, quote, "make a fair and realistic contribution towards the cost of social services they enjoy, and the government should charge Africans accordingly," end quote. Their requests, obviously, all fell on deaf ears. There was, of course, the very practical measure of birth control, but again, this would require African cooperation to some degree. The Family Planning Association of Rhodesia, or FPAR for short, was the primary medium for the state's family planning agenda. In 1965, the state provided merely 12% of FPAR's funding, but this jumped to 51% by 1974 and then 98% in 1979, reflecting the increasing political commitment and will to slowing down the ever-increasing African horde. In 1970, the first Committee on Population Problems was formed and met for the first time. Their report laid out various ways in which the African birth rate could be lowered. The first idea was to simply put the cost on the Africans themselves. If they wanted to breed like rabbits, then they could pay the price, was the logic. One method of cost internalization for large families was the expansion of prosecutions of criminal neglect for parents of underfed children. The report also advocated changing the system of grants to African councils to provide incentives to, quote, "change the present system from the taxation of adult males to the taxation of the total number in the family," end quote. In the same vein, the report noted that the, quote, "subsidization by central government of social services is inconsistent with a policy aimed at reducing the birth rate because it insulates the people from the true cost of having large families, especially where a number of the services subsidized are for the benefit of children," end quote. The low-cost hospital charges for Africans were amongst those subsidies found to create incentives counter to government policy. The report also recommended targeting African women's materialistic desires, which had certainly worked in the United States. The report recommended, quote, "the more attention be given to stimulating the material wants of tribal Africans, particularly the women, whom, it is believed, would respond more readily to such action than would men." The committee has in mind the expansion of extension activities for women's clubs and the promotion of sales of consumer goods, end quote. The report also went on to state, quote, "the desire for emancipation among African women should be exploited to the fullest extent by the Ministries of Internal Affairs, Health and Local Government and Housing in their efforts to improve the standards of living of families, especially women and children," end quote. Following the report, the Minister of Health reiterated the importance of targeting government propaganda towards African women and stated that Africans must be introduced to the cash economy. The latter change would make children an economic burden rather than an asset. The Minister of Health went on to explain why women were targeted rather than men. Quote, "While African women showed interest in family planning, the same could not be said of African males, who, once they achieved a measure of material success, hankered after the pleasures of subsistence-level tribal living, which included several wives and large families." End quote. Furthermore, the report called for flooding school curricula with small family propaganda, and funds were requested for the mass distribution of contraceptives. The Minister of Health suggested that they could go even further. There were other incentives and disincentives that could be used, but these were, quote, played down somewhat to avoid an accusation of ruthlessness. There were, of course, many other disincentives available to government, but these types of actions would undoubtedly lead to criticism, especially overseas, end quote. The report did, however, conclude that this topic needed further discussion. Specifically, the legalization of abortion and voluntary sterilization were mentioned. By the next year's meeting, nothing had been accomplished. Brownell writes of the Rhodesian Front's stance, quote, "The resulting memoranda, notwithstanding the excitement that population issues elicited in the wider public, especially among the rank and file of the RF, were generally equivocal and conservative, and were much more an expression of prototypical bureaucratic caution than an all-in approach to an existential problem facing the regime." End quote. Despite clamors from the right of the party for mandatory birth control for Africans, or some kind of coercion or quid pro quo for using birth control, or accepting sterilization, nothing was done beyond contraceptive distribution and propaganda. The solution was to call another committee the following year to, quote, "examine the whole spectrum of population control and not limit it to the pure aspect of family planning," end quote, and, quote, "examine the problem in the broadest aspect of population control and to prepare an overall plan for the consideration of government," end quote. This third committee delivered its report in 1974 and conceded that state action should remain concentrated primarily on supporting FPAR. The broader-based initiatives to slow population growth were seen as unfeasible. By default, contraceptive distribution and propaganda became the sole solutions. In that same year, it was reported that only 20% of urban African women and 2.7% of rural African women were using birth control. Birth control pills from FPAR's Salisbury clinics increased from 43,254 to 49,889 by 1979, and their Depo-Provera birth control shots went up from 13,279 to 45,336. In 1976, FPAR reported that from 1970 to 1976, Rhodesia's growth rate had dropped from 3.8% to 3.4%, and that by 1976, FPAR had prevented 25,000 births. This was obviously barely even scratching the surface, and almost all of the success was confined to urban areas, and then later within the protected villages, which the RF government set up to contain Africans away from the terrorists. The African population continued to grow by hundreds of thousands per year, and, as expected, the Rhodesians were completely and utterly swamped in their own country, despite white immigration. The great swamping by the Africans was one of the main reasons for Rhodesia's fall, but white emigration was perhaps even more important. After all, the Rhodesians had always been able to cope with being outnumbered, as shown by their ridiculous kill ratios in the Bush War. If there weren't enough whites to keep society running though, then it was all over. The 1962 and 69 censuses really brought reality home to the small white population. They knew there were few in number, that the Africans were many, but the real numbers were simply ridiculous. The most surprising aspect of the censuses was that of white emigration. There had been positive migration flows for much of Rhodesia's history, and so emigration was hardly noticed. A kind of illusion of demographic stability and continuity had developed within the white population. Now, the problem was brought to the forefront. In 1976, the Rhodesian Minister of Immigration, Elias Broomberg, informed Parliament, quote, "We have a section in our Immigration Promotion Department which sends a letter to every emigrant who is leaving the country, saying we understand that he is leaving, and in a very tactful way asking why, and if we can help, and if there is a chance of him changing his mind. Many of them appreciate it. They say, we cannot believe anybody is taking the interest in the fact we are leaving. They think this would not happen in any other country," end quote. The Rhodesian population had, whether anyone realized it or not, always been rather transient. Settlers in Rhodesia had a long history of simply drifting in and out of Rhodesia and other British territories in the region without retaining any particular loyalty to Rhodesia specifically. Secondly, white immigrants to Rhodesia didn't have any constraints from their home countries, so returning was always an option. After UDI, this transience increased as new white residents tended to simply emigrate when Rhodesia failed to meet their expectations, rather than just sticking it out. Perhaps the greatest trouble for Rhodesia was her southern neighbour. South Africa was far more powerful, both politically and economically, and would always welcome Rhodesians in with somewhat open arms. One might only have reservations due to South Africa being very much an Afrikaner-dominated state, whilst Rhodesia was extremely British. Lastly, Rhodesia was cursed with a ridiculously high standard of living. The white man had essentially carved out a paradise from nothing, and the cost of living was extremely low. A man who struggled to make ends meet in Britain might relocate to Rhodesia and fairly easily carve out a life for himself, in which he had a wonderful house, a swimming pool, seemingly endless land, and most importantly, a very safe environment to raise his children in. Before the war, Rhodesia had one of, if not the lowest crime rate in the world. This standard was obviously rather hard to maintain when the going got tough. Many, naturally, were not willing to accept this and simply emigrated or took the gap, as Rhodesians used to say. Most migrants who came to Rhodesia tended to be fairly well off, and so more than anything else, this allowed them to simply pack up and leave if they wanted to, as there would always be greener pastures. To put it into perspective, between 1955 and 1979, there was an average of 228,583 white Rhodesians living in the country at any one time. During that time, a total of 255,692 immigrants arrived in Rhodesia and 246,047 emigrated. On average, 4.1% of Rhodesia's white population emigrated each year, and an average of 4.6% had just moved there. Rhodesia has simply always been this way. Of the initial 700-strong pioneer column in 1890, there was only 15 left in Rhodesia in 1924. Very few would have died of old age by this point, given how young the average trooper was. In 1970, the Rhodesian Minister of Immigration conceded that, quote, "Emigration has been part and parcel of a pattern of life in Rhodesia since the beginning of time. How many of the great heroes of the past, Salou, Rhodes, Jameson, anyone you like to think of, how many actually died in this country? In the end, practically none of them," end quote. South Africa had nowhere near this level of transience. Between 1965 and 1983, 240,033 whites left that country, around 12,000 a year. In this same period, 760,703 whites arrived, so around 40,000 a year. The Rhodesian government and the more stable element of the Rhodesian population alike did their part to stop this mass exodus. Massive restrictions were placed on those wanting to emigrate. For example, in 1978, departing families were allowed to take only $1,400 in foreign currency with them out of the country. There were also petty restrictions, such as not being allowed to emigrate with a vehicle, which still had payments left on it. Exchange controls were also made very strict, so it was hard to obtain foreign currency at all. Travel was restricted for young men between 16 and 25 who hadn't completed their national service. The Defence Act was amended to make it an offence for a man to leave Rhodesia after having received call-up papers, and foreign schooling was limited. The government also pleaded with their whites to stay and stick it out, and state propaganda reflected this. Those that had already left tended to go to South Africa, and Ian Smith would end up having to beg them to assist in stopping the flow. In the dying days of Rhodesia, when Prime Minister Muzorewa was at the helm, he even proposed a $20,000 Rhodesian fine for those seeking to emigrate, if they ever wished to re-enter the country at a later date, although this was rejected. The Rhodesia Herald likened the Defence Act amendment to the Berlin Wall, and an African MP caused uproar by supporting greater emigration restrictions simply because it would cause more whites to leave the country. Socially, those who wanted to take the gap or take the chicken run were shamed. This could only work for so long, and even those who had joined in with the shaming eventually, to their own surprise as much as anyone else's, found the allure of emigration simply too much to resist. In 1977, a Scottish automobile worker was quoted as saying in an interview, quote, "Yes, we're taking the chicken run, but nobody wants to admit it publicly. If the word gets out, the revenue office will be breathing down your neck to see if you're fiddling some extra cash out," end quote. A lot of the population was very much in this boat, and there was a lot of bet hedging going on. Many whites would attempt to hold on for as long as they could prosper, but also prepared for their most likely inevitable exit on short notice. This was somewhat natural for a people who had several homelands. Those who had been in Rhodesia for generations felt more strongly about their homeland, but new arrivals had many other outposts of British civilization to run off to if it came to it, never mind Britain itself. Their people, if they still classified themselves as British as opposed to Rhodesian, were not under any existential threat, which would have bound almost everyone to stand and fight had it been the case. In 1978, former Prime Minister Roy Welensky remarked that emigration was, quote, the hemorrhage that will bleed us to death, end quote. A decade after UDI, Ian Smith was asked what his greatest achievement had been so far. UDI was mentioned, but when he had first come to power via his internal party coup, the issue of stemming white emigration was right at the forefront as well. Indeed, during his pre-UDI negotiations, the topic of emigration was always discussed when he met with his British counterparts. If independence weren't granted, he said, then most whites would more likely pack up and leave, which would trigger a collapse. They had no faith in black rule, a fear which was later to be justified. Smith's answer to the question was, quote, I would say that UDI was a part of it, but I think the greatest achievement, and I am happy to have played my part in it, was restoring the Rhodesians the confidence in their own country, which we found they had lost when we came to power. We found that Rhodesians were leaving because they had no more confidence in the political future of their own country. I believe this government has succeeded in changing that. We, first of all, had to stem the tide of people leaving. Then we turned the tide, and I am happy to say we regained more than we lost. I believe this, more than anything else, is the greatest achievement that the Rhodesian Front government can claim. I believe we saved Rhodesia, end quote. One of the main problems with white emigration was its effect on the security forces. Especially during the last years of Rhodesia's existence, the security forces were forced to rely more and more on African soldiers, something the state was never overly comfortable with. A decreasing manpower pool of whites also meant less whites to train these blacks. Very few blacks met the right standards to do this job themselves. Whenever the Rhodesian state attempted to increase conscription, they also, in the process, ended up increasing emigration. It was a very difficult situation to maneuver indeed, quite the balancing act. This persistent manpower problem is what caused Rhodesia to focus on small special forces style operations rather than large-scale operations to clear and hold territory. A top-secret internal strategic directive from July 1979 read, quote, even if the best possible employment of troops evolves, our deployment levels in any given area will remain totally inadequate. Therefore, to undertake meaningful high-density offensive operations in one area will inevitably cause reductions in the other areas, in which we are already overstretched. This leaves us little option but to take high risks in 3 or 4 areas to help resolve problems in other areas, taken one at a time, end quote. Rhodesian propaganda relied very heavily on kill ratios, and indeed, the Rhodesians were doing a lot more killing than being killed. As the war reached its later stages, however, these numbers narrowed slightly. This, combined with the widening population ratios between whites and blacks, looked very grim indeed. Morale took a massive hit, and only now did the military decide to chime in and state that actually, kill ratios, which they had boasted about all throughout the war, didn't mean that much after all. This wasn't overly convincing to most Rhodesians, to say the least. The measures taken, obviously, were nowhere near enough at any point to ever turn the tide. Radical and potentially unthinkable action was required to turn around such a racial ratio. No one had the stomach, the will, nor perhaps even the means to do it. There was simply nothing the Rhodesians could do to halt the swamping. That is not to say that Rhodesia was doomed to lose the war. There was, of course, many other factors at play. Rhodesia did win the war, at least militarily. Politically, she was defeated by not only Wound Fair, but more importantly, by the entire world ganging up against her and labeling her as a terrorist state, simply for standing up for Western civilization and holding firm. Rhodesia's great moral cause was labeled as an immoral, evil one. Any serious attempts to address the birth rate issue would almost certainly have brought down masses of black propaganda from the Western democracies, the likes of which had not been seen since World War II. Rhodesia was in quite the bind. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then please do leave a like. It helps immensely. An especially big thank you to those of you that have signed up to my subscribe star or as a YouTube member. Without your kind support, I simply wouldn't be able to do these videos for a living, and I cannot thank you enough. Even the lowest $5 tier helps immensely. Thank you.